eventually pat, 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 and then eventually something longer. They learn a bunch of sounds at once, and they combine them in different ways and babble in all kinds of crazy ways. And so they're learning that as they go. They're also learning that those sound combinations have meaning, so they're able to be reinforced because they know that a ball is a ball or a dog is a dog, and they get reinforced through that. And then again, like through how we talked about reading develops, the same thing happens with speech and language, that they get that feedback of practicing advanced speech production at utterances that are complex syntax and complex semantics and then eventually complex phonology, and they develop all of those systems at the same time. So this type of theory allows for a lot of language interplay, which is really important for the kids that we work with because phonology doesn't develop in isolation. And so that's why I really like this theory in particular, because it allows for the inclusion of language, which is a huge aspect of how kids learn how to produce speech sounds. So it doesn't have a lot of strong ties to the SLP world in contrast to natural phonology. Natural phonology has very strong ties and application to the speech pathology world. This is actually the foundation of phonological processes. So it's through this theory that the idea of phonological processes came to be, through these folks, Stamp and Ingram. So the idea of patterns kind of came from linguistics more than it came from a clinical speech pathology world, and we've definitely applied it, which is part of the reason that I'm relatively lax with your phonetic transcription, because I think it's an incredibly useful tool for clinic, but you don't need to be nitty-gritty about the nuances between languages whenever you're transcribing disordered speech. But this kind of came from the idea that there's certain sounds that are universal across languages, or certain patterns of sounds that are universal across languages, or patterns that are typically occurring in young children. And that's where the idea of natural phonological processes came to be, that there's these certain patterns that happen in development that happen across all kids who speak English. Of course, there's a few exceptions. And then when those processes continue past the age that they should have assimilated or dissolved, then that's when we consider it to be a disorder. So these are patterns that just naturally happen as children are acquiring English. Oh, one more, sorry. So sonority hypothesis, I think this is the last one, yeah. Sonority hypothesis. This is also an interesting one because if you recall, when we were talking about the different types of sounds, we talked about obstruents and we talked about sonorants. And obstruents were those sounds that had some sort of constriction in the vocal tract, and sonorants were ones that had an open vocal tract. So that, like vowels and glides. So this idea is that louder sounds are ones that had a more open vocal tract, like vowels and glides, are more sonorous. Those that have the more quiet, think of it more along the lines of a spectrum, like stops and fricatives, are less sonorous. And this is important because it's been shown to affect clusters. So when children delete clusters as a part of cluster reduction, which we'll talk about in about a second, when children delete or reduce the amount of consonants within a cluster, they usually delete the sound that is less sonorous. And this also affects phoneme deletion tasks.
Is that the same thing for like voice and voiceless? Like maybe more likely to drop the voiceless, or is that not related?
It's not this theory, but that's a different idea.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay, so now we'll get into phonological processes. So you've probably heard some of these patterns. So which ones have you heard of? Stopping, fronting, consonant, final consonant deletion, backing. So you've heard these before, so this is not brand new information, but so we'll get into some nitty-gritties about them. I'm going to divide them into typical processes and atypical processes. So we'll start with typical processes first and go through all of those. Then we'll talk about atypical processes. I don't actually think we'll get, what time is it? 7:05. We may or may not get to the atypical one, so we'll see. So these are the typical processes. What I mean by that is these are the processes are following a typical trajectory of development. So these are things we would see in an average, typically developing young child. We would see most of these disappearing around the ages 3 to 3.5 on average, with some wiggle room built in. Definitely 4. But these are things that the average kid does just as a part of learning language and learning English. A lot of these patterns. That doesn't mean that every child who is learning English will do every single one of these every single time and in any certain order. But these are just common patterns that have been observed over time throughout the development. When they persist past this age is when we consider it to be a delay or disorder, depending. So when they hold, I just said this, when they hold on to the processes past the age, that's considered a phonological delay. These typical processes shouldn't occur more than 40% of the time in a child's speech once they're past that age of assimilation or the age at which they should have begun to delete it. And so I say there's a bit of wiggle room because you might see that they're using some of these processes sometimes, but not all the time. So they're starting to assimilate or they're starting to delete them from use. But that's why we say it shouldn't occur more than 40% of the time, because if it does, then that's showing us they're really not getting it. They're not removing this from their language. Yeah, Emily.
If a child is like a late talker or delayed in their language development, or I'm sorry, their speech development, does that age which the processes should be disappearing, like, does that get pushed further?
That's
or
a good
should
question.
You start when they're like still younger?
Well, so that's a good question. You have to have speech to analyze. So if they're a late talker and they're 2, and that means that they have fewer than 50 words, they're not combining 2 words quite yet, it may be difficult to actually see what patterns they're doing because they might not have enough words to actually even see what's happening, to even analyze. So you do have to kind of take it with a grain of salt. You wouldn't say their speech production isn't there though. You would probably say you just can't analyze it yet.
So if they have enough words to say by like 4 or 5 then, but they're speaking like a 2-year-old, then, I guess that would
Yeah,
be
you would still,
disordered then.
yeah, you would still call it a delay. Yeah,
Okay.
and you would take into consideration that they had been a late talker, so they haven't had as much experience with the process of speaking, but you would still consider that to be delayed for sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. Okay, so we consider these phonological delays because these are typical processes. These happen in typical development, so it's a delay. When we get to the atypical ones, which we may or may not do today, if they're doing those processes, it's considered a disorder because those never happen in normal development and are very unusual, so it's a sign of a disorder. So for speech phonological processes, that's where we consider delay disorder. If it's a typical process, it's a delay. If it's an atypical process, it's a disorder. If they have a lot of typical processes and just one atypical process, you can call it a disorder because they do have one atypical process.
What if they have just a lot of typical?
You would call it a delay. And then that's where the severity comes in. So it can be a delay and be profound or be severe. So if they have like 100% of their speech is some form of process, you would say it's a profound delay or severe delay. It can go from mild to profound. Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to get into the nitty-gritties of each process. This is another example of having the phonetic fonts. And these look really small, so hopefully they came out okay on the PDF. But let me know if you need me to resave it. The only reason I saved it as a PDF is so you could see the font. So please let me know if you can't. So reduplication. What you'll see on each of these slides is you'll see the name of the process, and then you'll see like a abbreviated version in parentheses. And I put that there so that if you, for your exams and your projects, if you prefer to just use an abbreviated version, then everybody's using the same abbreviated version. I don't have to guess what you're trying to tell me. Okay, so this is when one or more of the syllables within a word is repeated. This is really common in early development. Like when a child says wah wah instead of water, that's reduplication. They took one of the syllables and repeated it. With partial reduplication, you might see some variability. So you may not necessarily see like a child say tur for water. You're usually going to see wah wah, but you will see some variability of what kids are using. So this is something that affects the whole word or affects the syllable level. So this doesn't actually even affect the phoneme level because they're repeating either a whole syllable or the whole word. Daddy becoming dad. You might also hear this called doubling. If that's a process that a term you're used to using, please feel free to use it. We'll call it reduplication, but they mean the same thing. This is definitely, it's a huge part of development. You can probably, this is something that even just kind of the average person knows, not calling it reduplication, but knows that kids say, wah wah and da da and those types of things. We see this especially within the first 50 words. So they're learning a lot of language at this time, and so they're trying to make it easier on themselves, so they simplify things by reduplicating them and producing the easier part of the word, which is usually the stressed syllable. You'll very rarely hear them repeat a weak syllable or the unstressed syllable within a word. It's usually the stressed syllable that's repeated. This is another, like Angela had mentioned, a bit of a regression happening as kids are learning more motor or more language. And this is one that you might see go away early, but then come back. Because as multisyllabic words start to appear more and they have more language and more vocabulary to use, you might see them kind of regress a little bit in order to make the speech production itself easier, and then they kind of practice that and then gain the skills to move forward. A subset of this is the diminutive forms that you'll hear kids do, like calling a horse horsey or calling a dog doggy. So that's kind of a subset of this. It's a period of development that kids do. If you recall from the recorded lecture, I talked about that period of time when kids were learning jargon and transitional words, and that period of transitional words when parents hold on to calling it wah-wah forever, and now the kid's 19 and asking for wah-wah, which, those things happen. I think, do you guys have words in your family that are like you call your grandma Baba because the first grandchild did? Like, those things happen in a lot of families, and it's completely normal. But to a certain extent, we need to, as SLPs, be providing the correct feedback so that they eventually learn that wah-wah is water. And so that goes the same for this. It's fine to say back to a child, yeah, that's a doggy. But we can also just say back, you're right, that's a dog. And give them that correct form feedback. And that's how they learn to eventually assimilate these processes and delete them from their language, is because they've gotten the feedback that what they were saying was a diminutive form and they need the advanced form. Does that make sense? This is a common one to see those transitional words kind of get hung on to for a while. Names of pacifiers, names of stuffed animals, names of blankets, names of grandparents. Okay, final consonant deletion. This is one that we mentioned. So this is when the consonant after a vowel, so post-vocalic is after the vowel, when a consonant or post-vocalic consonant of a syllable is omitted. So it's when the final consonant in the word or a final consonant in a syllable is completely omitted. When final consonant deletion occurs, there's only the vowel left at the end of that syllable. So if a child, oh darn it, this is an impossible classroom. If the word is bend, and the child says ben, is that final consonant deletion? No, because there is a final consonant right here. So they did not delete the final consonants. This is not final consonant deletion. This is, any ideas? I know we haven't talked about it yet. Cluster reduction. So this is a final cluster, and they've reduced the cluster from 2 consonants to 1. We'll talk about that one in a second. That's kind of a trick. I know we didn't talk about that one yet. But so it's really important, though, to remember that when it's final consonant deletion, there will only be a vowel left at the end. If there's a consonant at the end, it can't be final consonant deletion because there's a final consonant there. So it has to end in a vowel. So what you'll see here, what this is saying is final consonant or post-vocalic consonant. So if the word is rainbow, you may see, that's a bad example because it's, oh yeah, we can do this. You may see a child delete this, the N at the end of rain, because it's a post-vocalic at the end of a syllable. So you may hear rainbow. So they're deleting that consonant because it's at the end of a syllable. Does that make sense? They may do both. They may only do at the end of the word, or let me think of an example of Batman. So they may do just dropping the final N, and they may also drop this T. So you might get Batman, or you might get Batman. Does that make sense?
And that is considered a final consonant?
Yeah. Yeah, because it's either final consonant or the post-vocalic consonant within a syllable. So here's some other examples. Ghost becomes go, cat becomes cat, hot dog becomes hada. Let's see. So you also might see, like in the example of bend, if the child said bet and did delete that final cluster, then you may also hear that called total cluster deletion, and that's fine too, because that's what's happening. Both of those things are happening. The cluster is being deleted and the final consonants are being deleted, so these things will overlap, because again, these are not like hard and fast things that have been created by the Big Bang Theory.
Mm-hmm.
These are things that someone developed based on a theory, so they'll overlap and they're a little messy. So this is a very common one. It's definitely a part of normal development. All these typical ones are a part of normal development. So we see this happen a lot. And usually assimilated by age 3, so it's usually something that we see disappear by age 3. And kids who have phonological difficulty, so this is a very common one for them to continue to do. Is there something I'm missing back here? Is there online chatting happening? Okay. So weak syllable deletion is the next one. This is another time that it's really important for you to know stressed versus unstressed syllables, because a lot of times what kids will do is delete the weak syllable within a word, but they'll very rarely delete the stressed syllable in a word. Especially, and that makes sense, especially if the word is only 2 syllables, every word has stress. So if they delete the unstressed syllable, it would sound very strange. Or delete the stressed syllable would sound very strange. So as an example, banana becomes nana, potato becomes tato. So you've probably heard these before, but just maybe didn't really think of them as the weak syllable being deleted. You'll also hear it maybe called unstressed syllable deletion or syllable reduction. I prefer weak syllable deletion. It's your call. Those are all acceptable. Okay. Another thing to keep in mind with this particular one is that it may be part of some dialects. So that's something to keep in mind whenever you're doing your case history, talking to the families and getting information from the families about what their history is. You definitely want to get information about some patterns that you might see to see if this is something that is representative of their dialect. Yeah.
If a child had both weak syllable deletion and final consonant deletion, and then like a case like Batman or Rainbow, would it just be like Bat and Ray?
Yeah. And so that's what makes speech sound sample analysis really complicated, because if you don't know what they're referring to, there would be no way of you to know what they're referring to or what they're doing, that they're doing weak syllable deletion. That's the other thing about phonological processes, is if you don't know what the child is attempting to say, then you can't say what pattern they're using, because you don't know what they're doing instead. You can only kind of talk about what they are capable of doing. But a lot of these overlap, so you'll definitely see these happening at the same time. And so the best way to figure out what a child's doing is, what do you think? Get a lot of information from the parent and caregiver and get a really in-depth speech sample. So that speech sample is going to be your lifesaver, because it's going to show you where the patterns are. We talked about strident sounds versus stop sound, or versus fricative sounds. So remember, there was the H and the voiced and voiceless TH that were the only fricatives that aren't stridents. So the only way you'd know what a child's doing with fricatives versus stridents is if you had a whole sample and you analyzed it for patterns.
I know it probably isn't always the best, but so I talked earlier about the little girl that's going to be joining, and so she has like a lot of these that we've talked about so far, and she does have weak syllable deletion and final consonant. And my supervisor showed me her Bulbin Fristo, and it's incredible to just see that it goes to nothing, goes to nothing, goes to nothing, goes to nothing, like the pattern just starting to emerge across the different words.
It is. It's very cool, and I think that's why I love phonology so much, because for these kids, you always find the pattern. You always find, you can figure out what they're doing, and sometimes it's just this most obscure thing that doesn't fall into any category that's been established, but it is some sort of pattern. I worked with a kid once who I was trying to fit what he was doing into all these boxes of, I think it's weak syllable deletion and final consonant deletion and stopping, And then when I looked, all of his obstruents were affected. So it's not always these night